Burt Reynolds had begun to fade long before he stopped breathing. September 6, 2018. Jupiter, Florida. Outside, the world still adored him. Posters on walls, reruns on late-night television, a generation that still called him the Bandit. Inside, the laughter that had once filled theaters had narrowed to the soft rasp of failing breath. Friends were coming, but slowly, like a delayed standing ovation. The phone kept ringing in the other room, reporters already chasing a story he hadn't finished living. For 82 years, Burt Reynolds had outrun everything, failure, heartbreak, even time itself. But on this September morning, the legend who once defined speed was learning the cruelest truth of all. The finish line is always lonely. The man who once made America believe that laughter could outrun loneliness lay beneath the same sun that had made him famous, now too weak to open his eyes. Around him, silence pooled where applause used to live. By afternoon, the legend and the man would finally part ways. He was 82. His heart, which had carried him through car crashes and broken romances and the wreckage of a career he'd simultaneously built and destroyed, was failing. There were people nearby, staff, friends who would arrive too late. But Burt Reynolds died the way men who spend their lives performing masculinity often die. Surrounded by evidence of who they'd been, isolated by the gap between the legend and the man, having outlived the era when anyone believed invincibility was real. The news spread quickly. Burt Reynolds dead at 82. The last of the old-school movie stars. The man who'd been box office gold in the 70s, who'd defined what American manhood looked like, who'd had it all and tried to rebuild and lost it again. Hollywood would mourn. Clint Eastwood would issue statements. Arnold Schwarzenegger would post tributes. The world would remember the mustache, the laugh, the Trans Am doing a 160 with the top down. But who would remember Burton Leon Reynolds Jr., the kid from Michigan who'd wanted to play football and became a movie star because his knee shattered and his dreams had to be rebuilt from wreckage? The man who spent half his life playing Burt Reynolds and the other half trying to find out who he actually was underneath the performance. You can't be a legend and a human being at the same time. Days before his death, Burt had been working. Still acting at 82, still showing up on sets, still trying to prove something to an industry that had moved on decades ago. He'd been cast in Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, a film about the end of an era, about aging actors watching their world change. It was perfect. Cosmic justice. The role Burt had been preparing for his entire life, but he died before filming began. The role went to Bruce Dern. Burt's final performance would be in a movie nobody saw. His last words captured by cameras that stored them in archives rather than theaters. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who'd followed his career. Burt Reynolds, who turned down James Bond and Han Solo and John McClane because he didn't want to be tied down, who'd rejected the biggest roles in cinema history because he wanted freedom, ended his life desperate for any role, any chance to prove he still mattered. He'd spent his peak years running from commitment and his final years chasing it. Spent his youth afraid of being trapped and his old age terrified of being forgotten. Was this really just heart failure and old age? Or was it the inevitable conclusion of a life spent performing masculinity so convincingly that even Burt forgot there was supposed to be a person underneath? What if Burt Reynolds didn't die from cardiac arrest but from the exhaustion of being a legend, from the cost of defining American manhood for a generation, and then watching that definition become obsolete? The man who outran everything finally ran out of road, because Burt Reynolds was speed incarnate. Cars, stunts, romance, decisions. Everything fast, everything maximum velocity, everything living like consequences were for people who moved slow enough to get caught. And for a while, it worked. For a glorious decade, Burt Reynolds was the biggest movie star in the world, untouchable, invincible, the American masculine ideal wrapped in a Trans Am going full throttle with no destination except away. But you can't outrun time, can't outrun age. Can't outrun every decision you made at maximum speed without looking back. Eventually, the car runs out of gas. Eventually, you're 82 in Jupiter, dying alone in a house full of memorabilia from a life that feels like it belonged to someone else. He wasn't born to be a legend. He was born Burt Reynolds Jr. on February 11, 1936 in Lansing, Michigan. The son of a police chief and a mother who wanted more for her boy than small-town life and a badge. The family moved to Florida when Burt was young. Riviera Beach, a place where the sun was hot and expectations were clear. Boys played football, got tough, learned to be men by learning to hit hard and get hit harder and never show pain because pain was weakness. And weakness was the worst thing a man could be. Burt was good at football, better than good, exceptional. Fast, aggressive, fearless in ways that made coaches love him and opponents fear him. By high school, he was a star. By college at Florida State University, he was being scouted by the NFL. The Baltimore Colts wanted him. Professional football was the dream, the apex of American masculinity in the 1950s, proof you were man enough to compete at the highest level. Football taught Burt everything he'd later apply to acting and life. Perform toughness even when you're hurt. Never show weakness even when you're broken. Move fast so nobody sees the fear underneath the confidence. Masculinity wasn't something you were. It was something you performed so convincingly that eventually you forgot you were performing. Could a boy raised to believe showing emotion was failure ever learn to access emotion as an actor? When your entire identity is built on being tough, being fast, being the guy who never breaks, what happens when life demands you break? In 1955, everything changed. Car accident. His knee was destroyed. The NFL scouts stopped calling. The dream of professional football died on impact. He was 19, his identity shattered along with his kneecap, facing a future he'd never planned for because he'd been so certain the only future was football. Florida State gave him a scholarship to stay even though he couldn't play. He needed something to fill the void. A teacher suggested acting. Burt dismissed it initially. Acting was for people who weren't tough enough for real life, for men who weren't quite masculine enough. But he was desperate, lost, trying to figure out who Burt Reynolds was if he wasn't a football player. He discovered he was good at it. Acting gave him what football had, the performance, the adrenaline, the sense of being watched and admired. And it gave him something football hadn't, the ability to be different people, to hide behind characters, to never have to figure out who he actually was because he could always be playing someone else. After college, Burt moved to New York, studied acting, took odd jobs, slept in his truck when he couldn't afford rent. The struggling actor narrative looks romantic in retrospect, but what it omits is the humiliation, the desperation, the nights sleeping in a vehicle wondering if this was better than a shattered football dream or just a different kind of failure. He started getting work, small parts on television, guest spots on westerns. Enough to survive, but not enough to matter. He was handsome, dark hair, strong features, the kind of masculine beauty cameras loved. But Hollywood had no shortage of handsome men. Burt needed something to distinguish himself. He developed a persona. Charming, self-deprecating, funny, dangerous but safe. Masculine but approachable. The guy every man wanted to be and every woman wanted to be with. It was calculated, strategic. A performance of effortless confidence that required enormous effort to maintain. He could fake laughter for a camera but not for a mirror. By the late 60s, Burt was working steadily on television. Gunsmoke, Dan August. Roles that paid well but weren't making him a star. He was in his 30s. Hollywood was changing. The old studio system was dying. New actors like Dustin Hoffman and Al Pacino were redefining leading men. Smaller, more vulnerable, more human. Burt represented the old model, tall, handsome, traditionally masculine. He could have become obsolete before he ever became famous, but Burt understood something the new actors didn't. Masculinity was performance, and he performed it better than anyone. He wasn't trying to be real. He was trying to be a fantasy version of masculine that audiences needed. Strong but not threatening. Tough but funny. Dangerous but ultimately safe. He was building Burt Reynolds the brand, even if it meant Burton Reynolds the person disappeared in the process. In 1972, everything changed. Deliverance. A film about four men on a canoe trip that becomes a nightmare of violence and survival. Burt was offered the lead, Lewis Medlock, the alpha male who thinks he can control nature and discovers how wrong he is. The film was dark, violent, psychological. It was also the role that would make Burt Reynolds a movie star. Deliverance was a critical and commercial success. Burt's performance was praised. He did his own stunts. Of course he did, because Burt Reynolds doing his own stunts was part of the brand, part of the performance of fearless masculinity. He went over a waterfall. Could have died. Nearly did. But the footage was spectacular, and spectacular footage made legends, and Burt was building a legend even if it killed him. Hollywood came calling. Suddenly, Burt Reynolds was in demand. Scripts arrived daily, offers for films, commercials, everything. This was the moment careers are built on, the inflection point where an actor becomes a star. He turned down James Bond, turned down Superman, would later turn down Die Hard and Terms of Endearment and countless other films that became iconic. His reasoning was always the same. He didn't want to be tied down, didn't want to be typecast, didn't want to commit to franchises that felt like cages. He wanted freedom, wanted to move fast, make decisions quickly, keep options open. I had it all, then I lost it all. The trick is not to lose yourself twice. But what Burt was really running from was the fear that if he committed, if he stopped moving long enough to be seen clearly, people would realize he was performing. That Burt Reynolds was a character Burton Reynolds was playing, and the character was more interesting than the man. Instead of Bond, Burt chose films like The Longest Yard and Smokey and the Bandit. Action comedies where he could be charming and tough and funny, where he could drive fast cars and perform the version of masculinity that felt safe because it was so clearly performance that nobody expected depth underneath. Smokey and the Bandit made Burt the biggest box office star in the world. 1977, the film was massive. The Trans Am became iconic. Burt's mustache became iconic. For 5 years, from 1978 to 1982, Burt Reynolds was the #1 box office star in the world. Not just successful, dominant. The apex of fame. Fame is like a car with no brakes. Looks great until you try to stop. He lived like someone who believed the peak would last forever. Bought a ranch. Bought horses and cars and a football team. Invested in films he wanted to direct. Spent money like it was endless because when you're #1 in the world, you believe the money will keep coming. The fame will never fade. You'll always be able to outrun consequences. He dated Sally Field, the love of his life, though he didn't realize it until she was gone. They met on Smokey and the Bandit. The chemistry was immediate, real in ways that transcended the script. She saw through the performance, saw Burton underneath Burt, and for a brief moment he let her. But he couldn't sustain it. Couldn't be vulnerable long enough to build something real. She wanted commitment, honesty, a man who could stop performing. He wanted to keep running. In 1982, she left. He spent the rest of his life regretting it. If I had one wish, it's that I'd told Sally I loved her before it was too late. He married Lonnie Anderson in 1988. It looked like a power couple. Two beautiful people, both famous, both wealthy. But the marriage was troubled from the start. They fought about money, careers, the adoption of their son, Quentin. The relationship was public and bitter. Their divorce in 1993, one of the most expensive and acrimonious in Hollywood history. But fame had already started fading before the divorce destroyed him. By the mid-'80s, Burt Reynolds wasn't the biggest star anymore. Action movies were evolving. Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone represented a new kind of masculinity, bigger, more cartoonish. Tom Cruise represented another kind, younger, pretty, vulnerable under the confidence. Burt represented the 70s, and the 70s were over. He kept working, kept making films. But the films got smaller, the budgets tighter, the roles less interesting. He made bad decisions, directed films that flopped. Stick lost millions. He fought with directors, developed a reputation for being difficult. The charm that had made him a star curdled into defensiveness. He was protecting the legend, but in doing so he was burning bridges, alienating people who might have helped him transition. The divorce destroyed Burt financially. He'd already lost millions on failed film investments. The settlement with Lonnie was enormous. By 1996, Burt Reynolds declared bankruptcy. He owed $10 million. The ranch was sold. The cars were sold. The memorabilia from his career, awards, props, costumes, auctioned off. Everything he'd built was liquidated to pay debts. I was everyone's hero but my own. The bankruptcy wasn't just financial, it was existential. Burt Reynolds, who'd been #1 in the world, who'd defined success and masculinity for a generation, was broke. The legend had failed in the most public, humiliating way possible. And failure for a man who'd built his identity on never failing was worse than death. Hollywood didn't rush to help. The phone stopped ringing. Scripts stopped arriving. The industry that had loved him when he was on top was indifferent now that he'd fallen. When no one calls you to make movies, the silence is scarier than any action scene. He moved to Florida, back to where he'd started, bought a modest house in Jupiter, taught acting at a local university, appeared at memorabilia conventions, signing autographs for fans who remembered when he was the biggest star in the world. It was humble, humanizing. But Burt couldn't let go of the legend. Even broke, even forgotten, he was still performing Burt Reynolds, still telling stories about stunts and conquests and glory days, still the charming raconteur, still running from the possibility that without the legend there was nothing. The man who defined strength had never learned what it felt like to be safe. Then came 1997. Paul Thomas Anderson offered Burt a role in Boogie Nights. Jack Horner, a pornographic film director who believes he's making art, who treats his actors like family, who's delusional and dignified and ultimately tragic. It was a supporting role. Burt would have to play someone pathetic, someone past his prime, someone clinging to relevance in an industry that's moved beyond him. It was also the most honest role Burt Reynolds had ever been offered. Jack Horner was Burt Reynolds with the legend stripped away, a man performing dignity while the world laughs, believing he matters while everyone knows he doesn't, trying to create family from people who are using him because actual family has abandoned him. Burt took the role, and he was magnificent, raw, vulnerable, funny, sad. Everything Burt had spent his career avoiding. Jack Horner was the performance Burt Reynolds would have given if he'd ever stopped performing Burt Reynolds long enough to access the person underneath. The film was a massive critical success. Burt won a Golden Globe, was nominated for an Academy Award. It was the comeback everyone loves, the fallen star redeemed, proof that Burt Reynolds still mattered. But Burt didn't attend the Oscars, refused to go. His official reason was a scheduling conflict. The real reason was that he couldn't bear to sit in that audience, nominated for a supporting role, no longer the leading man, reduced to playing a pathetic character who reminded everyone, including himself, that he was past his prime. He'd rather be forgotten than pitied, but forgetting hurts longer. The mirror never lies, it just waits for you to stop lying first. Burt kept working after Boogie Nights. Small roles, guest spots, direct-to-video films nobody saw. He needed the money. Bankruptcy had taken everything. But he also needed the work because work was the only identity he had. Burt Reynolds didn't know how to be anything except an actor playing Burt Reynolds. His health declined. Heart surgeries, back surgeries. Decades of doing his own stunts had destroyed his body. He was in chronic pain, took medication, moved slower. The man who'd built his legend on speed and invincibility was trapped in a body that betrayed him, that made the legend impossible to maintain. He wrote a memoir in 2015, But Enough About Me. The title was perfect, self-deprecating, charming, classic Burt Reynolds. The content was revealing in its refusal to reveal. Page after page of anecdotes and jokes and stories about other people, but very little about Burt Reynolds himself. Even in autobiography, Burt was performing, deflecting, entertaining rather than excavating. There was one section that felt true. About Sally Field. About how he'd loved her and lost her and never stopped regretting it. About how he'd pushed her away because he was afraid of being vulnerable, afraid she'd see through the performance and leave anyway. So he left first. I should have held on tighter. In his final years, Burt became quieter. The charm was still there, but softer. The laugh was still there, but tinged with something that might have been acceptance or resignation. He gave interviews where he admitted to mistakes. Talked about regrets. Said he wished he'd taken James Bond, wished he'd treated Sally better, wished he'd saved money, wished he'd been less cocky and more grateful. It might have been wisdom. Or it might have been one final performance. The aging star doing the "I've learned from my mistakes" routine that audiences expect from fallen legends. Hollywood tried to give him one last gift. Quentin Tarantino, who'd grown up worshipping Burt Reynolds, cast him in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. A film about the end of an era. About aging actors watching their industry change. About legends trying to survive their own obsolescence. It was perfect. The role Burt had been preparing for his entire life. The one that would let him play out his own story on screen. He died before filming began. September 6, 2018, heart attack. Alone in Jupiter, Florida, in a house full of memorabilia from a life that belonged to someone who looked like him but might have been someone else entirely. The funeral was small. Private. Burt had requested no spectacle, no Hollywood production. His ashes were scattered. There was a memorial later, a public event where friends and colleagues told stories. Everyone talked about the laugh, the mustache, the Trans Am, the legend. Almost nobody talked about Burt Reynolds because almost nobody had known him. Sally Field didn't attend. Released a statement saying Burt had been a difficult man but a brilliant actor. The statement was gracious and distant. Whatever she'd loved about him was buried under years of his inability to be what she needed. When I die, I hope they remember I laughed. They did remember. Social media filled with clips of Burt on talk shows, charming Johnny Carson telling stories, laughing that famous laugh. The Trans Am from Smokey and the Bandit was displayed at his memorial. People shared their favorite Burt Reynolds moments. All performances, all the legend, all Burt Reynolds the character. Almost no one talked about Burt Reynolds Jr. The kid from Florida who'd wanted to play football and became a movie star because his knee shattered. The man who'd spent half his life playing a character named Burt Reynolds and the other half trying to figure out if there was anyone underneath the performance. Burt Reynolds proved you could be the biggest star in the world and still be lonely. Proved you could define masculinity for a generation and still not know who you were as a man. Proved you could have everything, fame, money, beauty, success, and lose it all not because the world took it, but because you were so busy running you never stopped to hold on to anything. He proved that legends are built on performances, and performances require distance from reality. And if you perform long enough, you forget where the character ends and the person begins. He proved that American masculinity, the tough, charming, fearless version he embodied, was a cage disguised as freedom. Does every legend have to kill the man who created it? Or is the performance the only way men like Burt ever learned to feel alive? The questions matter because Burt Reynolds wasn't unique. He was the template. Every leading man who came after learned from watching him. Perform confidence even when you're uncertain. Perform strength even when you're broken. Perform invincibility even when you're dying. Be the legend, not the human. The legend sells. The human is just machinery that produces the legend. Burt Reynolds ran faster than Hollywood, faster than his peers, faster than age and relevance and changing definitions of what American men should be. He ran so fast that for a while it looked like he might outrun time itself. Eventually the car runs out of gas. Eventually you're 82 in Jupiter, dying in a house full of evidence of who you were, isolated by the gap between the performance and the person, having outlived the era when anyone believed Burt Reynolds was anything except a beautiful, tragic, cautionary tale about the cost of being a legend. The Trans Am is in a museum now. The mustache is a pop culture reference. The laugh echoes in YouTube clips. Burt Reynolds, the legend, is immortal, frozen in celluloid at his peak, forever charming, forever tough, forever running. Burt Reynolds Jr. is buried quietly in Florida. And the distance between those two truths, between the legend and the man, between the performance and the performer, is where he lived and where he died and where he'll remain. Caught in the gap between the character everyone loved and the person almost no one knew. You can't be a legend and a human being at the same time. Burt Reynolds chose legend, or legend chose him. Or maybe there was never a choice. Maybe once the performance started, it couldn't stop. Maybe once you become Burt Reynolds, you can never go back to being Burton. Maybe the crash that shattered his knee also shattered the possibility of ever being anything except a performance of masculinity so convincing it consumed the man producing it. The last thing Burt Reynolds said before he died was something about getting back to work. Still performing. Still trying to prove he mattered. Still running even though there was nowhere left to run except the silence that comes when the legend ends and all that's left is the human underneath. If there was ever anyone there, if Burt Reynolds wasn't consumed completely by Burt Reynolds, that silence found him in Jupiter. Not suddenly, gradually, over years of declining fame and failing health and the slow realization that the legend was over and all that remained was an old man in Florida teaching acting classes and signing autographs and living off memories of when he mattered. Maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that he lost everything. Money can be lost, fame fades, bodies break. The tragedy is that he never figured out who he was without the legend. Never stopped performing long enough to discover if Burt Reynolds was interesting, was lovable, was enough without being Burt Reynolds the movie star. He was everyone's hero but never his own. Defined masculinity for millions but couldn't figure out how to be a man when cameras stopped rolling. Ran faster than everyone in Hollywood but couldn't outrun himself, asking questions he never wanted to answer, demanding vulnerability he never learned to give. The performance ended in Jupiter. The legend lives forever, trapped in celluloid, driving Trans Ams through memory, laughing on talk shows in eternal reruns, forever young, forever charming, forever Burt Reynolds at his peak. And Burt Reynolds Jr.? He's the ghost in the footage. The person you can't quite see underneath the mustache and the charm and the performance. The man who wanted to play football and became a movie star. Who loved Sally Field and pushed her away. Who had everything and lost it and never figured out if there was anything left worth finding. The car's in a museum. The man is gone. And somewhere in the space between them, between the Trans Am doing 160 with the top down and the elderly man dying alone in Florida, is the truth about what it costs to be a legend. To perform masculinity so well you forget how to be human. To run so fast you never stop to wonder where you're going or who you're leaving behind.